happened and he saw it. Now, a testimony like that, I'm not inclined to doubt it. But in terms of the Eldridge, the same claims have been made over a period of years that it disappeared from the Philadelphia Navy Yard, appeared at Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard, and then reappeared in Philadelphia. Now, this would be on the second test and prior to its total disappearance. I have no proof of the statements about the Eldridge. I've never been able to find anyone who was actually witness to this happening or was on board the ship and saw it reappear at the Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard. I'm not discrediting it, saying it could not have happened, but I have no proof whatever that it did happen. But what did happen that is of record to the Eldridge is something else. And I might add, there was a third ship involved in these tests, the DE-013, name unknown to me right now. And it was tested out in the Azores, truly at sea. And it sank with all hands. As far as I know, the Navy never attempted to salvage the ship. Now, why the ship in the Azores sank, I have no idea. There's been some strange stories and rumors, and of course, the only one that is really well known is the one of the Eldridge. Now, to go back to the Eldridge and the aftermath, that is immediately after the tests were over, and it was for some time sitting at dockside, and then, of course, disappeared out to sea in the normal sea service. Mr. Schneider, that is Captain Schneider, wrote a series of letters to various people in and out of the Navy regarding the whole event of the Eldridge. I'm going to show these letters on the screen here. But understand that this is of a ship which allegedly never took part in anything like the Philadelphia experiment. But here is the chief medical officer describing the problems. The fourth and last letter is the most interesting of all. How I acquired these is very interesting. It came from Phil Schneider, his son. I will show the first one here. Will not attempt to read it through the back of the book. But he makes one error. He refers to DE-173 as the USS Fayoseth. He did not do it after that. Fayoseth was the commercial merchant ship. And it shows that there was a great problem regarding security, and that this was of great concern to him and a number of other people for a number of years. That was letter number 1, written on 12 December 1944, and as you may have noted, U.S. Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, official Navy stationary for the non-existent test. Test number 2, letter number 2, 17 April 1953, is written again by Dr. Schneider, MD, to Lieutenant General Nathan F. Twining regarding the lack of precision in the search for artifacts aboard the Eldridge and trying to determine exactly what happened during the period of the test and its aftermath. You will probably have noted in reading this that on 21 April 1953, J. Edgar Hoover got into the act requiring maximum security and personnel evaluation of psychological unit at Quantico, Virginia. Quantico, of course, being a Navy and Marine base. Letter number 3, 23 April 1953, just a few days after the third one, to Dr. E.U. Condon, regarding, again, the whole problem with the Eldridge and Hoover's involvement and so forth. And this is another rather interesting letter. The fourth and final letter is the most interesting one of all. This one is written to a superior in the Navy's medical department, a man by the name of Farnborough, MD, on a violate section coding. And the date on this is 6 March 1955, when one of the sailors died, and crew member number 9. They did an autopsy. And in the process of this autopsy, he found a strange object buried in the guy's brain, which he shows an illustration of, approximately 1.25 inches long, 1/4 inch in diameter, metal tip with some very strange coded markings on it, which are not normal English or normal Earth language, apparently. He had no idea what it was. He said it appears to be an implant, and it was in his brain. I emphasize that because even today, we cannot implant an object like this in a human brain and have the person survive. But there it was. It had been there for quite some period of time, along with 3 others. He notes the fact that there were 4 implants in this one person's body. What is it? Do you have any idea? He asked his superior in the service. This last letter was, I think, the most important of them all because it answers a question which I had had in my mind for many years, and at the time, right after the experiments, with number 1 and number 2, especially number 2, were completed, there were rumors among the sailors, while the ship was in hyperspace, that something very strange happened, and there were extraterrestrials running around on board the ship on the deck. Apparently those below deck, no one ever reported any such incidents, but those who survived on deck did report strange incidents. I dismissed them. I didn't believe it. But after reading these letters, as Al Bilek, as I've never saw them until a few years ago, it now answers that question. Were there extraterrestrials on board the Eldridge in more than hyperspace? The answer appears to be yes. Because those objects were not something we had any technology whatever to replicate at the time of 1943. And implants at that time were unknown. Now, what actually happened? I told you what happened on the outside, and in that period of time, as noted by people watching the Eldridge disappear and reappear, and then I gave my testimony. Now, what was my testimony? At this point, it gets perhaps a little bizarre to the ideas of some people, but it needs to go into the record. On the inside of the ship, where Duncan and I were running the equipment for this test on 12 August 43, on command, we turned everything on. Everything seemed to be working, functioning in a totally normal manner, and we didn't notice anything unusual for about 30 seconds. Then things started to happen. At that point, we've got a very strange phenomenon appear in the control room, which appeared like high voltage arc over some equipment. There was no high voltage equipment in that compartment, therefore it was all the more strange to us because while it resembled high voltage arc overs, there was no high voltage equipment. It was in multiple colors too, by the way, which would follow some types of high voltage discharge. And we tried to get someone on the radio. The radio had nothing but static on it, so we didn't know at that point what to do. We had no one on the outside to give us instructions, so we were on our own. And of course, we had been instructed. If you are on your own, if something goes wrong, it's up to you to make the judgments as to what to do. If you have to, shut the equipment down. So that's what we attempted to do. We found that the main control handles for the AC power coming out of the very large 8 megawatt alternator, diesel electric, we could not budge them. They were frozen in place. As conditions started to get worse and other conditions started to show, namely of the 3000 6L6 tubes which drove the field coils of the 2 alternators, the standard old-fashioned glass bulb type stand about this high. The smaller ones have been built since, but they were about that high. I'm sure anyone who knows any of the electronics around the beginning years, the 30s, 40s, and the beginning years after the war, knows what a glass envelope 6L6 looks like. They get rather hot. They have a very pleasant glow to them from the heater or the filament inside the cathode. But with 3,000 of them, you generate quite a bit of light and quite a lot of heat. That was one of the problems keeping that compartment cool. But they started to glow in a very strange manner, and they started to waver. Instead of it being a constant level of illumination, which is to be expected, they got brighter, and then they got weaker, and they were doing a fluctuation type of thing in terms of the illumination level. We considered this as very abnormal, because we've never seen a phenomenon like this before, and the amount of power involved, with 3,000 of these in terms of heater power, was quite sizable. And with the high voltage arc over and the inability to shut the equipment off, we decided it was time to get out of there. Ran out, opened the bulkhead door, ran out on deck, saw sailors milling around, but again, did not see anything abnormal. We went for the railing. We both had the same idea at the same time. Let's jump overboard and swim ashore. There's nothing we can do. Everything appeared normal to the ship, up to the railing and slightly beyond. But a short distance beyond the railing, there was nothing but a solid gray fog. Well, we didn't think anything about that. We said, let's jump overboard, and we did. I mean, we didn't say this verbally. This was, shall we say, simultaneous mental thinking. We jumped overboard. And we never hit the water. We were good swimmers. We weren't worried about the height. Never hit the water. We started to fall. The sensation was like falling down an elevator shaft with no bottom. And down we went, and down we went. And suddenly, we were, shall we say, perhaps panic-stricken. We didn't have enough time to worry about being panic-stricken, but we were totally dismayed. We had not the slightest idea what was going on. We were more or less side by side. And this went on until what we estimate was about 2 minutes later. We arrived at a very strange location. At night, standing upright, next to a chain-link fence. And it was dark. We didn't know where we were, but we knew it was a military base in all likelihood because the chain-link fence was of a military design. At that point, very suddenly, a very bright spotlight beamed down on us, illuminated us very brightly. And we wondered what that was. Well, we know what searchlights were, but it was on a helicopter, and helicopters were unknown to us because in 1943 there were very few. They were experimental. But as it turned out, this was a production-type helicopter, as we learned later. But MPs came out of someplace and grabbed us and took us to a building. In the building, on an elevator, down the elevator shaft, the door opens. We see a lot of military personnel and a very elderly civilian in a gray business suit, white hair, what was left of it on the side of his head, walking towards us. He looks at us and says, "Gentlemen, I've been expecting you. Now, Dr. John von Neumann." So we look at him. He says, "You're who?" And I says, "I'm Dr. John von Neumann." Couldn't be. We left him approximately an hour or so ago. And he's a much younger man. Couldn't be you. He looked at us rather sternly and says, "Gentlemen, this is not 1943. This is 1983. I am the same Dr. von Neumann you knew in 1943, except I'm 40 years older. Welcome to the Montauk Air Force Station," or words to that effect. We didn't know whether to believe him or not. We didn't know what was going on. And he took us for a cook's tour. Well, this tour included IBM 360 and 370 computers, tape recorders, all of the paraphernalia of a 360 and 370, disk drives, visual displays, which were special for the facility, and all of this, and many other pieces of unknown to us electronic equipment. And then, of course, after this little tour, we happened to go past a room where there was a large screen color television set in display, operational. We came back to that later, but he took us all over, and as it became dawn, he took us upstairs and let us look around the base. We never were taken off base. They let us sit down and relax a bit, and says, "Why don't you watch TV for a while?" So we did. Now, from the standpoint of 1943, where you had only 10-inch black and white color television sets, the more standard chassis being the RCA 630TS, which any of the older aficionados will know. I worked on many of them afterwards. That was all it was then in 43. But here we're looking at large screen color TV, a 27-inch type or something like that. Good sound, color, and of course we watched some of the news shows and other things, and it showed traffic jams on the freeways. What was a freeway? There weren't any in 43 except the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which is the first in the country. and advertising, which made no sense to us, but what really finally got to us and convinced us that maybe the old man was right, was an ad by, I believe it was American Airlines, saying, in essence, to those listening to the ad, on your next vacation trip to Hawaii, why not fly with us in our 747 jet? Well, of course. Now, if you think we might have been confused at this point, you're absolutely right. To take it back a little bit, all through the period of when we were working on the equipment for the test, we didn't know whether it was going to work properly or not before the first test with the Eldridge, though the prior equipment in 1940 worked very well, but it was a different design and a much lower power. In the first test, everything went well, and we didn't fully believe that it would work, but it did. The second test, we had a fairly good idea it was probably going to work, but we had, just prior to this test for 3 days, that is starting approximately 9 August, this terrible queasy feeling in our stomach, which I previously mentioned. And we simply didn't know what was coming down. We felt something was wrong. But up to the point where we emerged at what we were told was Montauk Air Force Station at Montauk, Long Island, we didn't really know that there was something wrong. We didn't have time to think about it as we went falling through this tunnel, if you will. Then we arrive at the point and we are completely surprised, we are completely overwhelmed, and then we're taken to the underground facility. We're completely dumbfounded and totally disoriented is perhaps a mild word as to what we felt. Disoriented and completely flabbergasted because nothing fit anything that we knew. And then when we sat down in front of a color TV, I mean, from 10-inch black and white to some 27-inch color TV, there's a bit of a jump for what was to us perhaps 10 minutes. 10 minutes in terms of the time reference. We were very, very confused at this point. Emotions are going through our heads and everything else, and we simply didn't know how to handle it, if you want to put it bluntly. We didn't know what to do about it. There wasn't anything we could do about it. But at this point, while we were discussing it among ourselves and quite thoroughly concerned, dismayed, whatever, John Van Neumann comes in again. Dr. Van Neumann says to us, gentlemen, we have a problem. I said, oh, okay. The ship, the Eldridge, locked up with experiments we're doing here at Montauk. And so the equipment is very similar, though it's more high-powered here. And the concepts under which we're operating are very similar to what the Eldridge did. They're both involving use of time and time equations and this sort of thing, which we understood. But he said the problem is that the Eldridge locked up at the station, and it was on the 12th of August of 1943 when the Eldridge was yanked out of the harbor and into hyperspace. We know it's there. The hyperspace bubble, which is considered artificial, actually is being fed by the generators aboard the Eldridge and is growing. We've got to shut it down, but there's no way we can do it. We can shut down our equipment here, but that bubble is being fed by the equipment aboard the Eldridge. And unless the fuel runs out before we estimate about 30 days, or equipment breaks down, this thing can keep running for 30 days, and that bubble will grow, and we don't know how big it may get. He said, theoretically, it could engulf the Earth. We can't have this happen. You have to go back there and shut the equipment down. And I looked at John, and I said, are you trying to tell us that we're going to go back to the Eldridge, and we don't even know how we got here in the first place? And he says, there is no problem, gentlemen. He says, here at Montauk, we have complete control over space and time. We can send you anywhere as we want at any time we want. That, of course, is referring to the functions of the Montauk project, which I'll get into later. But true to their word, they sent us back to the decks of the Eldridge, and they put us in radiation suits, something similar to what you see on the various shows today and the sci-fi shows and what, of course, the astronauts have worn out in space, and sent us back to the decks of the Eldridge. Now, what they did, we didn't understand, except we stood by an opening in a wall, and we were sucked into it, and we wound up in the decks of the Eldridge. This was, of course, the Montauk Time Tunnel, which I will go into at length later. We arrived in the decks of the Eldridge, took off our helmets, Instructions were smash the equipment, destroy it, whatever you have to do to shut it down. It didn't matter. We arrived back on the decks. We see sailors milling all over the place, obviously quite distraught. We went in the control room. We found axes and started smashing everything in sight with axes. Insulated gloves in our hands, of course. That was part of the suit. So if glass flew or high voltage arced out at us, well, at least we were protected. After we smashed enough equipment, of course, particularly that equipment which was driving the field coils of the two big alternators and all the control functions for the alternator, they started to wind down. Now, they're very massive, and of course we knew it would take 2 or 3 minutes before they wound down totally. They might be putting out field energy in the meantime. That is energy to the field of the torque coils on the deck. So when this was done, we went out on the deck. We figured it's over. At that point, we saw 2 sailors buried in the steel deck, 2 more buried upright, standing upright in bulkheads. One of them, my younger brother, Jim, who was in the process, as the other 3, of dying. The 5th man had his hand in a steel bulkhead. He wasn't dying, and he lived. They cut his hand off at the wrist and gave him an artificial hand. As to the others, it was a very, very sad and tragic thing to see them. We could do nothing whatever about what was happening to them, because what do you do if a body, as the later examination showed, what do you do if a body is completely embedded in the steel and the steel molecules are embedded in the physical body? In other words, the molecules of flesh are mixed and intermingled with the molecules of steel. Something we had never seen before, we'd never heard of before, and hopefully nobody's ever seen since. But that was what happened on the Eldridge, and of course, at a later date, those bodies were removed. But at that particular point, one of them, Jim, was still quite conscious. I walked over to him, put my arms around him, and Duncan, in the meantime, took one look at this scenario, which there were other sailors running around totally crazy. Some were fading in and out of reality, or that is what appeared to be happening. Duncan heads to the rail, looks at me, and like, aren't you coming along? I wasn't about to, because I was trying to comfort Jim. He jumped over the rail and disappeared. He was no longer in the reality of 1943. Of course, at that exact point, he wasn't in 1943 either, because the ship was not yet fully returned to that point in the harbor from which it had left, 12 August 1943.